Hello and welcome to the Patent Literacy Symposium and this session, Teaching Spelling to the Intermediate Poor Spellers, Never Too Late. My name is Dr. Pam Kastner and I am joined by my colleague, Lauren Lutz. She's going to give you a little wave there. We are excited to facilitate this session for everyone. And before we start, we have a few housekeeping items to review. First, you can access the presenter handouts for this session, the presenter bio, and the conference schedule on the Patent website, and the link is provided for you in the chat. Just as a reminder, this session will be recorded and is 75 minutes in length, which includes a 15-minute question and answer period. To access closed captioning, click on the icon CC Live Transcript on the Zoom control panel. If you experience technological difficulties, please go to the Technological Support Guides area above the schedule on the symposium page. Please keep your video feature off and stay muted to eliminate any potential distractions during the presentation portion of our session. We would love for you to tweet out or share out on social media all you are learning from the Literacy Symposium. The hashtag for the symposium is #PatentLit2022. And now we would like to welcome once again our literacy hero, Dr. Louisa Moats.
Thank you so much, Pam. And you also are a hero for sponsoring conferences like this and winning the confidence of over 4,000 people who know that when they attend a conference like this, they're going to learn something worthwhile. So I hope to be a contributor to the greater mission here. All right, so I get to talk about my favorite topic, which is teaching spelling and teaching, and in this session, teaching spelling to intermediate students, because it isn't too late to improve the spelling of kids at 4th, 5th, 6th grade level. Most of the time, the issue is they haven't been taught very well what they need to know, and they haven't received enough practice. And behind the need for a lot of practice and a lot of informed instruction is simply the fact that learning to spell is very difficult. It's more difficult than learning to read, and it's not uncommon that we see kids with respectable reading scores who are below where they should be in spelling. And why is spelling more difficult? Well, let's just think about our models of what goes into the storage of words in our word form areas, in our memories. In order to spell a word, we have to have stored an absolutely complete and accurate internal representation or memory for that word. We can't get by with an incomplete or partial memory or representation if we're trying to spell. So because reading is possible with somewhat degraded memories or somewhat incomplete memories for the exact letters in words, and word recognition is easier than word recall, it is fairly common that we see a gap developing with reasonably good instruction, but a gap that develops between kids' ability to read and their ability to spell, unless we deliberately target spelling along the way, which I hope to convince you to do. So there are many reasons why students have trouble. One is that they have weak underlying skills, and we'll be dealing with that. Another is that, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Another is that they haven't had sufficient instruction. And certainly, as I have experienced the whole field of language arts instruction over the years, I see very little attention to quality spelling instruction. Rather, what tends to happen is kids are given lists to memorize at home with the coaching of their parents, but very little classroom time is spent in typical classrooms teaching kids about how to spell. And therefore, there's insufficient practice. Although kids are asked to write sometimes, especially in the last dozen years or so, many classrooms have been persuaded that kids will somehow learn to spell if we just motivate them to write and we give them a lot of writing practice. Well, it actually doesn't work so well that way, because unless kids have specific information about how to spell words and have practiced those words and understood those concepts, they can invent spellings, and they can also write and avoid trying to use words that are hard for them to spell. And so all in all, they get insufficient practice with words that they don't already know. And then we have the problem of texting and uncorrected use of media postings, social media postings, where you commonly see misspellings that no one reacts to, because, I mean, in my case, when I see them, I just feel like I don't want to pile on the person and correct their spelling publicly with some kind of posted comment. It's kind of rude, but nevertheless, I'm thinking kind of negative thoughts about the literacy level of that individual, because it is also true that especially with higher standards for educational performance, we do tend to judge someone's literacy level by the way they write, and that's unavoidable. And then there's the belief that spell checkers are going to solve everything, and predictable text, or if you dictate into a telephone that it's going to spell everything correctly. Well, those tools can be helpful, but nevertheless, you need a certain knowledge base in order to use those technology supports well. And you still need to be able to recognize a correct spelling. You still need to be able to resolve spellings of homophones and names and things like that. So to frame what I'm going to say about teaching intermediate students, I want to run through the framework that Linnea Eyre and has provided us, the phase theory of reading and spelling development from the standpoint of how kids spell, and also remind everyone that although the literature on spelling development is about 1/10 of the size of the literature on reading development, nevertheless, we do have some researchers who've been publishing in this area over the last 4 decades or so. So our pre-alphabetic learners don't understand the alphabetic principle. And actually, this was something that my daughter Charlotte wrote at almost age 5, when she tried to write her name, and she knew that these letters were on the end, and she knew there was an H in there, but she had to fill in some other letters to make what she wrote look something like the length of the word that she had seen that represented her name. But she did not understand the alphabetic principle at that time. Now, a partial alphabetic phase learner is going to use letters to represent speech sounds, but rely on their knowledge of letter names. So this sign says, "Welcome home, Ma." Welcome home, Ma, all as one undifferentiated word. But what distinguishes this from this is that there is an attempt, a good attempt, to use letter name knowledge to represent the salient sounds, most often the consonant sounds, in the words that are being written. So, for example, because the letter name Y has the sound W in it, welcome can be spelled with a Y at this phase of spelling development. There's often little marking of word boundaries, and often the phonetic spelling is incomplete because phoneme awareness is not completely established, and students at this phase are still learning how to segment all of the speech sounds in a word they're trying to write. Now, students who've progressed from partial alphabetic to full alphabetic or later alphabetic phase spelling will write sentences with words that are relatively easy to decipher because they are phonetically accurate. So these are real spellings from kindergarten level kids. We went on a nature trail. I like to eat pizza and I like to drink pop. So what these writings represent is that learning to spell at the early stages involves a process of progressive differentiation of what exactly a spoken word is made up of. Phonemic awareness is the underpinning for being able to do this, and the growing ability to separate phonemes in the spoken word allows students then to map the letters that they see in print to those phonemes, even though they are still naive about the actual patterns in our orthography. For example, they may not have internalized the idea that every syllable has to have a vowel letter in it. For example, nature, using the letter name R for is very logical. And those of you who read transcriptions of other languages that have an sound in them know that often just the letter R is used in those other orthographies for the syllable, what we're calling a syllable here, in nature. So this student hasn't learned the silent E patterns for representing long vowels, hasn't learned vowel teams, hasn't learned also, if you look at and drink, hasn't learned that you have to represent the nasal phoneme in words like and drink with a nasal letter, that even though the vowel is nasalized in speech, and is really two speech gestures, which is a nasalized a, and the final phoneme d, and here it's dr, ing, which is k, and that it's a nasalized vowel here. Students often leave out the nasal letters in words like this because of the phonological properties of the words. But anyway, what they have to learn is to represent all of these phonemes using the appropriate letters. And that's when they do that, they will acquire what we call consolidated word learning, consolidated images of words in memory that are sufficiently detailed to recall them for spelling. And this is what we are aiming for when we work with older kids. But those older kids may still show signs and symptoms of being at an alphabetic, sometimes even an early alphabetic or partial alphabetic stage when they are not representing all the sounds. Or more typically, they're spelling phonetically, representing sounds just like a later alphabetic stage learner. But what they need to learn a lot more about how orthography works. So, for example, on the menu of things that they need to learn would be orthographic patterns, such as no word in English ends in V. If you have a final V, it has to be spelled VE, or they have to learn that in a word like brain, and these are all real errors that I've put here. So brain, that you don't use AY for A in the middle of a word, it has to be AI if it's that vowel team. For noisy, it's much more likely that that final syllable would be spelled with a Y than with a double E. And with chunk, spelling the nasal with an NG is phonetically accurate because that sound before k is the third nasal So this student has segmented all the sounds, and that's great. But the student needs the information that we don't spell with ng before, that we just use the letter N. So the chunk, UNK, is the way we spell that sound combination. Also, students need to learn the conventions for syllable patterns, for joining syllables together, and for adding suffixes to words. So the drop silent E rule, when a student hasn't gotten to this point yet, they might spell a word with a silent E, like an ing, with those two morphemes together without paying attention to the fact that silent E has to be dropped when you add a suffix beginning with a vowel. And with the word beginning, they don't yet know that the final N has to be doubled when you add a suffix beginning with a vowel to a word that ends in an accented 111 or a single vowel, single consonant syllable. Let's call it the consonant doubling rule. And also they have to learn about morphemes and the morpheme constituents of words that are multisyllabic, and many words that have more than one syllable, especially at the intermediate level, are going to be made up of either Anglo-Saxon morpheme combinations or Latin morpheme combinations. And then as they progress, the students will have to learn more about Greek-based morphemes and their combinations. So instead of spelling educational like this, which is a good phonetic spelling, we would need to move the student along by teaching them about the root DUC, DUCT, meaning to lead, and the prefix E or X, which is the same prefix in different forms in Latin, the suffix shun, the suffix AL, to put that word together. And we'd have to teach that the word nature is made up of a root NAT, which is also found in native and natural and other nativity, other words that have the root NAT, meaning to be born. And we have to get them to think about electricity as having the base word electric, which ends in the letter C. And the letter C, we now learn, is useful in words like this because it can represent both the sound k and the sound s. So when we teach basic phonics and we teach kids about hard and soft C, where that comes into place in multisyllabic word learning is with words like this, where the letter C can do two jobs and can remain consistent even if we add a suffix. That's very useful information. All right, let's think about a reference point, a conceptual reference point for understanding what we're trying to do when we teach spelling. For me, the Seidenberg triangle model is useful in remembering that when we teach spelling, we need to educate the phonological processing system, we need to educate the orthographic processing system, and we need to connect these processing systems to the meaning processor. And to the extent that we can link meaning with sound, with spelling, we can help students consolidate memories for words. And the strongest approach to teaching them will be an approach that connects these processing systems together as explicitly as possible, and also that puts word practice into a meaningful context. Now, to consider what we know just about a basic word. Here's a basic word, shocked. How do we remember this word? A good activity for all of you educators out there that we use a lot in our professional development is to take just about any word you can think of and describe it from the standpoint of its phonology, its orthography, its morphology, its meaning and uses. And in so doing, what you lay out when you kind of portray what's in your own brains about the word is actually what we're going after as teachers when we're trying to help students elaborate their mental dictionaries with associations to words. So with shocked, and this was the word I saw a fourth grader confuse when I was observing a classroom. The phonological features are that it is one spoken syllable, not two, even though there's an ED ending, and that's because the ED ending makes a sound t in this word. And it has 4 phonemes, sh, a, k, t. And that is to be distinguished from words with which it might be confused, like shot or shark or shucked. Right? So it's not any of those things. That's why we need to be accurate, because if we're not accurate in identifying what the phonemes are, we could be mistakenly confusing it with any of these words here. And we also need to process, or we know, if we know the word, its orthographic features. So we know that sh is represented with a letter combination. CK is or the phoneme k is represented with a letter combination, that this is a closed syllable. There's a short vowel in a closed syllable. The vowel is ah, not aw, not r, not something else. And the ED is pronounced t. And we recognize the morphemes. So there is a base word shock and an inflection, which out of context, we say is ed, or the past tense. We also know that the word has multiple meanings. So if you can envision our mental dictionaries, there are webs and networks of meaning, very elaborated in people who know a word well. And when we see this word, there is mentally, because of the way our brains are organized, there's a triggering of these multiple meanings that we know in our dictionaries, but they are, the right meaning is resolved very quickly if we see the word or use the word in context. So it can mean to be emotionally stunned or appalled. It can mean that you're actually jolted by electricity. It can mean that you've disinfected a swimming pool. There are probably other meanings. So we're also aware of the word's use. It can be a transitive verb in the sentence, the nurse shocked the patient during physical therapy. We hope that would be avoided. A predicate adjective, we were shocked by the news of her impending transfer. Now let's turn to a case study so that when we talk about instruction, we have in mind what real kids do when they need instruction at the intermediate level. So this student actually was a 6th grader when he wrote this. I am dyslexic. None of my family has dyslexia, although my dad might have it. My family noticed that we had to start doing something about it in the 5th grade. Then began my great adventure. We headed to Boston. It's amazing looking out a window in the city, the cars speeding by in a colorful blur of headlights and streetlights all around, the sounds of horns and sirens from all directions. Apparently, I had to go through like 8 hours of testing. Some of it was fun, though. After I finished testing, we needed to go to educational consultants at the blank, blank, blank center. I mean, obviously, this is a delightful person. And with verbal skills, great attitude, going through 8 hours of testing. That was fun. Okay, but just from a spelling standpoint, what does the writing indicate? What can we tell just from a writing sample about this student's needs? I mean, I always, if you know my work at all, I put a lot of emphasis on looking at spelling and writing in order to make some pretty solid inferences about the student's instructional needs. So from the standpoint, one of the questions to ask right in the beginning, if this student is unfamiliar to you and all you have is a writing sample, is how about phoneme awareness? And you answer that by looking at whether or not most phonemes in the words that are being transcribed are represented or not. So in this case, the student's writing is phonetically quite accurate. So let's look at it again. There are really very few instances. I have a hard time finding instances here of the student making phonologically based errors that really show an inability to track what the sounds are in the word. Rather, I see naivete about patterns in orthography. So, for example, using OW in the word sounds, it's a possibility, but it's less common than using OU. I see directions and adventure. So the student knows about TCH. He doesn't know when to use it, but the identification of what sounds are there is very good, especially when you look at directions, that he has the k in there. That's very good. The nasal is in there. Hours, all the sounds are there. Educational, very carefully transcribed, and so on. The only sound omission I see is the L and apparently. Otherwise, it's really very good. And this is a phonetic spelling of finished. Well, there's an S for sh, but there are no other errors of that kind. So that makes me turn to the conjecture or hypothesis that the student still needs some instruction in more advanced orthographic patterns, but most particularly the student is spelling by sound, if you will, and is not thinking about or is not yet informed about or aware of the morphological patterns in the words that he's writing. So the past tense is spelled phonetically, as in finished and noticed. Adventure is phonetically spelled. He doesn't know about the TURE final syllable on words like this. He doesn't know about FUL as a suffix. He doesn't know about ION as a suffix and AL as a suffix, or he doesn't know about the prefix and the root either. So there's a wide open invitation to us as teachers to begin to introduce morphological structures as we teach him to spell. And also, there are a few indicators in this writing sample that the student needs additional practice with some high frequency words that are somewhat irregular in their spelling. So we'll have something to say about this. How do we treat these words? So backing up here, in general, when we're thinking about designing spelling for intermediate students, there are 5 considerations, or I call these the 5 lenses for understanding English orthography and for developing students' knowledge of word structure and word spelling. And at any time. Any one of these angles for explaining English spelling or for focusing a lesson can be appropriate depending on what you're working with. So number one is language of origin, and I'll have something to say about all of these. Number one is language of origin, which accounts for many of the spelling conventions that we have. Number two, and this is major, is phoneme-grapheme correspondences, because this cannot be avoided. You can't just jump to morphology if a student doesn't have the basic phoneme-grapheme correspondence system established. But that system has complexities that are due to or caused by the conventions for spelling phonemes and graphemes according to the position they occur in within a word. So whether they're in the beginning of a word, the middle of a word, or the end of a word. And we have a lot of position constraints like that in English orthography that are much less common in other languages. And then we have some arbitrary, number four, some arbitrary letter order and sequence patterns that have to do with things like consonant doubling. There are only certain letters that can be doubled in English, others cannot. We have sequences of letters that are permissible and others that are not, and so on. And then morphology is increasingly important. And if a student is on track, it's fair to say that by the fourth grade level, if a student is on track, then consideration of morphology will have more usefulness as they learn spelling than these other more fundamental explanatory characteristics of English spelling. Okay, so when we're thinking about an ideal approach to instruction, it really should take into account all of these layers of language. To me, a structured language approach involves teaching the, quote, layers of language. And what are those layers? The base layer is phonological. The layer on that is orthographic. The layer on that is morphologic or morphological. And the layer on that is syntactic. And I think that with older kids, the difference between what we do with older kids and what we do with little kids is that with older kids, we can weave these strands together more tightly in an integrated lesson format because they need it all. They need to build one thing on another. And then we need to provide sufficient practice to enable generalization of what they're learning in the lesson to what they're writing. And as all of you will tell me in the Q&A, well, I have trouble getting kids to generalize what I've taught them in the lesson to their writing. And indeed, that is a classic problem here. So let's start with phonology. And this is a quote from a paper I was co-author on with Marie Cassar, Rebecca Treeman, and two other researchers a number of years ago. We ended up saying, after looking at the spelling errors of dyslexic kids, comparing them to the spelling growth of normally progressing kids, phonology, although important for all aspects of literacy learning, is even more critical in learning to spell than in learning to read. Orthographic knowledge is laid over a phonological foundation. If that phonological foundation is weak, orthographic skills cannot develop sufficiently to support good spelling and compensate for the underdeveloped phonological skills. So poor phonology will sabotage spelling because I've talked about this a lot. The phonological image of a word that we construct by taking the speech sounds apart and recognizing also the stress pattern in a multisyllabic word, the sequence of sounds. If that internal representation of the phonology of the word is eroded somehow, then it stands to reason that the orthographic mapping process will also be problematic. And as I state here, if these anchor points are incomplete, unclear, or misidentified, there isn't any Velcro to attach the graphemes to. And the result is students attempting to memorize letter sequences by visual imprinting or by using extraneous information such as configuration or context to try to use their eyes like a camera and try to take a picture of a word as if it did not have to be filtered through the phonological system in order to be remembered. And we know that that idea has been resoundingly discredited by reading scientists. So it's poor readers and poor spellers who rely on context and rely on extraneous information to try to spell. So in teaching phonology, I'm sorry, I have to get back to this. That is, our reference point is the actual inventory of what the speech sounds in a language are. So much discussion about phonology, and I guess I talked about this in the keynote. So much of the instruction about phonology skips the most important step, which is what are the speech sounds in the language system that we're teaching? And if you are teaching students in another language, it's really helpful to compare the phoneme inventory in that second language with the phoneme inventory in English. But in this case, suppose we were constructing a lesson, and in the lesson, the students had to distinguish between the phoneme ch and the phoneme j. And I'm going to illustrate that very thing in a minute. But we would want to reference for the students in the beginning the fact that there are two phonemes articulated the same way, except ch is voiceless and j is voiced. So if we're going to have a phoneme awareness activity in a lesson that is going to focus on spelling patterns that involve ch and j, we might start with a very brief, fun exercise that involves substituting sounds, deleting sounds, or chaining sounds. So for example, we might say to kids, say gin, now change j to ch. What's the new word? Say chunk, but now change ch to j. What's the new word? Say joke, now change j to ch. What's the new word? And then with these sounds on the ends of words, say etch, now change ch to j. What's the new word? Edge. Say lunge, now change j to ch. What's the new word? Lunch, and so on. So the phoneme awareness component is not random. It doesn't involve any old sounds you want to pull out of the hat. It involves the exact ones that are going to be emphasized in the lesson. And it's short and not very painful. I had to throw this in because I came across it. I want to be a schwa. It's never stressed. So if we happen to be teaching vowels and we happen to be teaching schwa, what we do in the phoneme awareness part of the lesson is have kids simply identify where a schwa is in a spoken word. Banana, where are the schwas? Which syllables? All right, back to j. Then the next thing we want to do is teach the information about orthography that the student needs to know in order to be able to handle j. So the information about j is that in the beginnings of words, it's spelled with a j or a g if the sound is followed by e, I, or y, the soft g. In addition, if the students are older and are ready for it, we think it's fun to add some information about this letter J. And some interesting things about it that I've learned over the years are that it was one of the last to be added to our alphabet because the sound did not exist in either Latin or Old English, our two base languages on which our writing system was originally based. The letter J is never in a consonant blend, and the letter J is never doubled. It's also never used at the ends of English words, so we're going to have to learn how to spell J at the ends of words. So first, we're going to consider how to spell J in the beginnings of words, and one of the activities that would be appropriate would be to complete these words or make real words by using a G or a J, and reminding kids, how do you know if the word is going to be giant? Well, the letter G is most likely in the construction of this word because the second letter is an I, and before E, I, and Y, we use the letter G typically. But in job, the letter is likely to be J. If we put a G there, the word would say gob because the letter G is followed by, if it's followed by O, A, or U, it's going to have its hard sound. So we practice this and then practice reading the words and writing some of the words to dictation. And then we also would want to do a phoneme-grapheme mapping activity and a word sorting activity and a word completion activity. But the way we might do this is to take words that end in the sound J, and instead of telling kids how it works, induce from them the insight after they have broken the word into its graphemes through phoneme-grapheme mapping and written DGE and GE and so on. We'd be able to have them look at all the DGE words and say, when do we use DGE? What kind of sound precedes DGE in every case? And they should be able to say, well, that's a short vowel spelled with a single vowel letter, and that's when we use DGE. On the other hand, when do we use GE? When it's preceded by a consonant. And in this case, these examples have the consonant N. There are also examples with consonant R and the consonant W and the consonant W. Okay, so then having done that, we would sort some of those words. So I'm moving on to sort of a different part of the unit, still that involves J and its spellings in the beginning and endings of words. But moving on, if we're working with the soft G and its spellings, it's a good time also to remind kids of the analogy between soft G and soft C, hard and soft G and hard and soft C, because the principle of these spelling patterns is the same, that after the hard C, we use the vowels O, A, and U or a consonant. The same after a hard G, we use the vowels A, O, and U or a consonant. But after a soft C, we use the vowels E, I, and Y. After soft G, we use the vowels E, I, and Y. So we want kids to understand that there is a larger pattern involving soft and hard C and G. But that is accomplished by having them sort the words into these categories and then talk about it. One principle that we're working on here is that the more insight kids have into how all this is working, and the less they believe that spelling is completely arbitrary, the more likely they are to have the tools for remembering words that they have to remember. Now, where does syllabification come in? A good technique for teaching multisyllabic word spelling is to have kids say a word by syllable and write each syllable on a card and put it back together again, or use a grid like this to write each syllable as they hear the syllables. Now, this exercise brings up the issue of whether to make a point of the morphemic structure of the word at the same time. I think that's an instructional choice, but just be sure about whether you're asking kids to divide the word by syllable or by morpheme, because the morpheme divisions in the word are going to be more apparent in the actual spelling than they are going to be in the pronunciation of the word. So if students are spelling introspection, the root is spect, S-B-E-C-T, but we don't pronounce the word introspect we pronounce it as introspection, with the shun syllable being spelled T-I-O-N. So technically the morpheme is I-O-N, and the suffix and the root is S-B-E-C-T. But if our goal is to have students syllabicate, then we should accept their perception of what's in the spoken word. And then when the whole word is in front of them, we can parse it by its morphemes and show how the morpheme structure is preserved in spelling, and talk about intro as a prefix, spect as a root, and ION as a noun suffix. So what I'm saying, if I could rephrase this, is to teach spelling, it's really advantageous to be clear about whether you are dividing words by syllable or by their meaningful parts, because spelling is a morphophonemic system. The meaningful parts are often represented in multisyllabic words, but they are not often or as easily apparent simply in the pronunciation without looking at the spelling. Another aspect of a move into the morphological layer of language would be to talk about roots, and that they are bound morphemes. You might not have to use that term. I personally believe in using correct terminology with intermediate level kids, even with younger kids, because there aren't that many words and these concepts are useful. But a bound morpheme, like a Latin root, has to have a prefix or a suffix added to it to make a word in English. That's different from a base word that can stand alone. So we, at least in my materials, use the term base word for that which can stand alone. I know there are others in our field who use the term base in a different way linguistically. I apologize that we're not all consistent, but just if you look at a source, do look at how the terms are defined in that source. I'm trying to define mine. Okay, so in sorting these words and roots, the student has to become more aware of the identity of some of these Latin roots, so that when they're put into multisyllabic words, they can be more easily identified. And same with base words, and we do add prefixes and suffixes to base words, but it's not necessary for them to stand alone as words. So having identified ject as a Latin root, we then can do a simple exercise where we begin to attach prefixes and define the meanings, common meanings of these prefixes, and define words that we create with the prefix and the root. So in this case, we're having kids create the word, reject, project, or project, or project, inject, interject, object, or object, eject, and we are having kids give a straightforward, simple, concrete definition of what these two parts might mean when they're added together. And then we would have a reading exercise. And one of the other things we have found about teaching spelling is that spelling and reading reinforce one another. So as we're teaching spellings, we want the advantage of having considered the spelling and learned the spelling to transfer to greater fluency in reading. And there have been controlled studies that have shown that when kids get spelling focused instruction, that their reading fluency and automatic word reading improve. So we have exercises on read all of these words with added parts, if you will, and see if on a second reading you can increase the time that it takes to read these words. And then we have the role of syntax in this lesson, and the relationship between syntax and the role that words play in sentences, the grammatical roles that words play in sentences, and their pronunciation. In this case, the spellings of these words are the same, even though their grammatical roles and their pronunciations are different. So these words can be either nouns or verbs, and their stress patterns change with the role that they're playing in the sentence. So I can object to someone's point of view, but I can also treat a word as a linguistic object. Those are words that I use a lot. I can reject someone's advice, but I don't myself want to be treated as a reject. I can project my wishes onto say a riddle or a question, and I can complete a project with hard work. So now what we've done is progress through the whole layer cake of language structure. All of what I presented before had to do with words whose spellings can be explained by explaining those layers of language structure. So what about high frequency irregular words? These still are a bit problematic. And in my own studies of the writing and spelling problems of intermediate level kids, it was pretty easy to develop a list of words that are particularly challenging for these kids to learn. One of the reasons why these high frequency, somewhat irregular words are hard to learn is that many of them are not content words, they are function words, or they are words that provide the grammatical glue in sentences, and they don't have those rich networks of meaning around them that can help anchor them in memory. They seem more arbitrary. It's not always true, but words like there, and there, where, here, and there. So here are the strategies that can be drawn on when you have students who struggle with those high frequency, somewhat irregular words. Well, first of all, just work with a few of them at a time. By all means, do not give your kids a list of 25 of the most often misspelled words and tell them to go home and grind away at trying to remember them. That's cruel and unusual punishment for someone whose memory is poor. So Number one, grouping words with some memorable similarity and working with those. So all of these words starting with TW, all having to do with two-ness. All the words having to do with oneness. The words having to do with possession. The words having to do with location. And then calling attention to the odd part of a word. And this is Linda Farrell's heart word technique, where although all of the sounds, some of the sounds, many of the sounds can be spelled by sound, the part that is unusual, like the IE in friend, put a little heart over it and say, this is the part that you have to remember as being the unusual spelling for that sound. Third, pronouncing the word the way it looks. This is extremely important because we are, as we learn these words, trying to match the print to speech, or that's what a good speller does. And a good speller will look at was and say, oh, it looks like Wes. And that may be done unconsciously, but it's still being done in the brain of a good speller. So why not help the poor spellers by building that habit of trying to pronounce the word the way it looks and then saying, oh, this is a little odd here, this part, but I will remember that in the word was, the last letter is S, not Z. I don't need a Z to spell the Z in was. And using mnemonics, these are familiar to anyone who's been a teacher. Some of them have, you can overdo that, so reserve that for the most important and useful ones. And then asking the learner, this number 5 is traditional in the teacher lore. It was widely used in the old Fernald technique, for example. It is a visual memory technique, which has limited value, but nevertheless, you may use it at times. Asking the learner to pay very close attention to the letter sequence by visualizing it and building it backward and forward with letter tiles before saying and writing it from memory. Try that. On occasion, it will work. It is not a strategy that you can rely on a whole lot, however. Okay, to sum up, and then we'll have questions. Spelling is harder than word recognition, but students can improve with good instruction and enough practice. Remember that reading and spelling rely on similar linguistic processes, so phonology is just as important, even more important for spelling, and learning about the layers of language is really critical for understanding how the English writing system works. Explicit instruction, how much have you heard that? A direct explicit instruction that is systematic and cumulative is going to work best rather than something that's random. Morphological knowledge is especially important for intermediate students who often get to the point, if they're just so bad spellers, of relying on phonetic spelling and not thinking about word structure. If they are really poor spellers, you will need to put more emphasis on phonology and basic patterns in orthography. So we can sum it up by saying students who understand that orthography can be mapped in systematic ways to speech, and that every word spelling has an explanation, are more likely to attend to the details in print and form lasting memories for the letters in words. So that's it.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. Okay.
I hope that you can see already the thanks are starting to come into the chat. I'm not sure that you can see that, but I hope that you can.